The Elizabethan Curriculum, a classical education for the modern man. Lecture 14. Ovid, the myths that made European art. At the end of our last lecture, I promised you the answer to a question. Why was the most sophisticated literary mind in Augustan Rome spending his time retelling myths that educated people already knew? The answer is not that Ovid lacked originality. It is that retelling known stories was, for Ovid, the whole point. Because what Ovid is doing in the Metamorphoses is not retelling myths, he is reading them. He is subjecting the inherited mythology of the Greek and Roman world to the same quality of ironic analytical attention that a good rhetorician brings to a text, finding in the familiar stories the questions that the familiar versions had always suppressed, the awkward implications, the uncomfortable moral distributions, the places where the official meaning and the actual meaning diverge. He is in the most precise sense doing what his rhetorical education taught him to do. He is reading against the grain. This is why Augustus found him dangerous. Not because the ars amatoria was obscene, though Augustus found it convenient to say so, because the Metamorphoses, read carefully, is a sustained examination of power, and the conclusions it reaches about power are not the conclusions that Augustus's cultural program required. The gods in the Metamorphoses are not wise and just and benevolent. They are powerful. These are not the same thing. They pursue, they transform, they punish, they reward, and the distribution of punishment and reward has very little to do with the moral desert of the recipient, and a great deal to do with the whims, the jealousies, the wounded pride, and the erotic appetites of the immortals. The universe of the Metamorphoses is not a moral universe. It is a universe of power, and a poet, who shows that with sufficient clarity in Augustan Rome, is writing political criticism in mythological dress. Now, the stories. Actaeon first, since you raised him, and since he's the purest expression of the principle I have just described. Actaeon is hunting on Mount Cithaeron with his companions when he wanders by chance into a grotto where Diana and her nymphs are bathing. He sees the goddess naked. Diana sees him seeing her, and here Ovid inserts one of his characteristic moments of analytical pause. He asks whether what follows is fortune or fault, whether what happens to Actaeon is the consequence of his error or simply his bad luck, and he does not answer. He moves on. Fortune or fault, it matters not to the outcome. Diana splashes water on Actaeon's face and tells him to go and say, if he can, that he saw Diana unclothed. As she speaks, the transformation begins. The description of Actaeon's transformation is one of the great set pieces of the Metamorphoses. Ovid moves through the body methodically, the neck lengthening, the ears growing pointed, the hands becoming hooves, the skin hardening into hide, and then the moment of terrible awareness when Actaeon sees his reflection in a pool and understands what has happened. He still has a human mind in an animal body. Deaf. He can think, but he cannot speak. He wants to cry out that he is Actaeon, that he is the master of these hounds that are now hunting him, and he cannot. The hounds catch him. His companions urge them on, calling for Actaeon, wondering where their master is, not knowing he is dying in front of them. The cruelty of this is precise, and Ovid means it to be precise. Actaeon is destroyed, not by his own wickedness, but by the mere fact of having seen something. And the destruction is complete. His identity is stripped from him before his body is torn apart, which makes the physical death almost secondary to the annihilation of the self that precedes it. He cannot even claim his own name at the moment of his dying. The ancient commentators who debated whether Diana was just were asking the right question, and Ovid was refusing to answer it, which is itself an answer of a kind. The Elizabethan reader, who had spent time at court, understood Actaeon rather personally. The courtier who sees something he was not supposed to see, who is present at the wrong moment, who knows too much by accident, is a familiar figure in the political landscape of any absolute monarch's reign. Quote, the myth gave a name and a form to an experience that was otherwise difficult to articulate. You did nothing wrong, you were simply there. And the goddess, whose body is her power and whose power cannot tolerate the witness, destroyed you for the seeing. Echo and Narcissus follow in the third book, and they belong together as a diptych on the subject of love that cannot connect. Echo is a nymph who has been punished by Juno for talking too much, specifically for keeping Juno occupied with conversation while Jupiter was pursuing other nymphs, and her punishment is to be able to speak only the last words of whatever she hears. She cannot initiate, she can only reflect. When she falls in love with the beautiful youth Narcissus and follows him through the woods, she can only repeat his own words back to him. When he calls out, "Is anyone there?" he answers, "There." When he says, "Come here," she says, "Come here," and emerges from the trees with her arms outstretched. Narcissus recoils in contempt. He does not want her. She wastes away until nothing is left of her but her voice, repeating in empty places the last words of others. Narcissus then falls in love with his own reflection in a pool, not knowing at first that what he sees is himself. Ovid handles this with extraordinary delicacy. Narcissus is genuinely suffering. He loves with complete sincerity and total commitment. The cruelty is not that he is vain, but that the object of his love is unreachable by definition, that every attempt to approach it destroys it, that the closer he gets, the further it recedes. He wastes away as Echo did, and in dying is transformed into the flower that bears his name, the narcissus that grows by water and bends perpetually toward its own reflection. What Ovid has given Western culture in these two stories is a pair of psychological archetypes that have proved inexhaustible. Echo is the person who has lost their own voice, who exists only in relation to another, whose love is pure reflection with nothing originating from inside. Narcissus is the person who cannot love anything outside themselves, not from strength, but from a wound, trapped in the loop of self-regard that looks like arrogance and is actually a kind of prison. These are not moral condemnations, they are observations. Ovid does not say Narcissus deserves his fate. He shows the mechanism by which a particular kind of beautiful isolation destroys itself, and he mourns it, and he moves on. The story of Arachne in the sixth book is one of the most politically interesting in the poem, and one of the most frequently overlooked. Arachne is a young woman from Lydia, the daughter of a dyer of entirely modest social origins, who has become so skilled at weaving that people say she must have learned from Minerva, the goddess of weaving and wisdom. Arachne is offended by this attribution. She learned from no one. Her skill is her own. She challenges Minerva to a contest. Minerva weaves a tapestry showing the gods in their divine majesty, the 12 Olympians enthroned, and in the corners 4 scenes of mortals who challenged the gods and were punished for it, a warning in textile. Arachne weaves a tapestry showing the gods in their amorous pursuits. Jupiter as a bull carrying Europa, Jupiter as an eagle carrying Ganymede, Jupiter as a shower of gold descending on Danae, Neptune, Apollo, Saturn, Bacchus, each shown in a transformation undertaken for the purpose of seduction or pursuit. Every story on Arachne's tapestry is true. Every story shows a god-abusing power for erotic purposes. The workmanship, Ovid tells us carefully, is perfect. Not even Minerva could find fault with the craft. So Minerva destroys the tapestry and strikes Arachne with her shuttle. Arachne, unable to bear the humiliation, hangs herself, and Minerva, with a sudden and unconvincing mercy, transforms the noose into a web and Arachne into a spider so that she may weave forever. The political reading of this story was not lost on the Elizabethan reader, and it is not subtle. Arachne produces a perfect work of art that tells the truth about power. The powerful destroy it and punish the artist. The transformation into a spider, perpetually weaving and perpetually marginalized, building beautiful structures that are swept away, is not mercy. It is a particularly refined form of the original punishment, and Ovid tells the story with a straightness that refuses the official reading at every turn. He will not let Minerva be right. The tapestry was true, the craft was perfect. But the craft was perfect. But what happened to Arachne was not justice. A poet who spent his career putting this kind of story into the most celebrated poem of the age was conducting a sustained argument with the moral framework that power always constructs around itself. He was doing it beautifully, wittily, in a form that delighted everyone, including the powerful, and the delight was itself part of the argument. If you can make the powerful laugh at stories about power's abuses, you have achieved something that direct criticism never could. You have made the truth entertaining. And entertainment, unlike argument, does not trigger the defensive response that makes the powerful stop listening. Orpheus in the Metamorphoses is a quite different figure from Virgil's Orpheus, and the difference is instructive. Virgil's Orpheus is a tragedy of irreversible loss, the man who almost recovered what he loved and failed at the last moment through an entirely human inability to trust. Ovid's Orpheus is something more complicated. He too loses Eurydice. She too descends. He too nearly succeeds and turns and loses her again. But Ovid's interest is not primarily in the loss. It is in what Orpheus does afterwards. After losing Eurydice the second time, Ovid's Orpheus retreats to a hilltop and sings, and the 10th book of the Metamorphoses is the songs he sings, a collection of stories within the story, told by Orpheus to the trees and animals that gather to hear him, because no human company can console him. The stories Orpheus chooses to tell are themselves significant. He sings of boys loved by gods, of girls overcome by forbidden passions, and the collection includes some of the darkest material in the poem. The story of Myrrha, who falls in love with her own father and conceives a child by him in the dark, not knowing who she is. The story of Venus and Adonis, which Shakespeare will make into his first great poem. But the story of Atalanta and the golden apples. Orpheus is using myth as Ovid uses myth throughout the poem, to say things that cannot otherwise be said. His songs are about the things that cannot be spoken directly. The impossible desires, and the transgressive passions and the loves that destroy, because they cannot be fulfilled. He is the poet figure within the poem, and what he demonstrates is that the power of song is the power to hold the unbearable in a form that can be contemplated. The trees lean in, the animals gather and are still, the stones move closer. This is what poetry does. It does not solve the unbearable. It gives it a form in which it can be endured. Pygmalion belongs to Orpheus's sequence of songs, and it is one of the most psychologically rich stories in the poem. Pygmalion is a sculptor who has become so disgusted with the vices of real women that he has made himself a statue of ivory of such perfect beauty that he falls in love with it. He brings it gifts, he dresses it, he lays it in his bed. He prays to Venus to give him a wife like his image, not quite daring to say, "Give me my image." Venus understands what he means. He comes home, embraces the statue, and feels it warm and soften under his hands. It becomes flesh. It becomes Galatea, the woman made from the ideal rather than the real, the beloved who is entirely the creation of the lover's imagination. This story has generated more subsequent versions than almost any other in the Metamorphoses, because It touches something that does not go away, the lover who prefers the created image to the living person. The artist, whose relationship with his art is more real to him than his relationship with the world. The question of whether the love that Pygmalion feels for the statue before it lives is the truest love in the poem, because it is entirely without self-interest, entirely without the complications that living people introduce, or whether it is the most deluded, because it is love for something that cannot answer. Shaw made a play of it. The musical version has never quite left the stage. Pa. It keeps coming back because it keeps being true about something. In our next lecture, we reach the end of the Metamorphoses, Ovid's own fate, and the question I have been holding in reserve since the beginning of the Ovid module. We will look at the Pythagorean speech that closes the poem's philosophical architecture, at the apotheosis of Caesar which closes its historical arc, and at the extraordinary final lines in which Ovid makes a claim for his poem that is either the greatest act of literary self-confidence in the ancient world or a kind of deliberate provocation to the gods of power. And we will look at the Tristia, the poems from exile, where the most brilliant and most ironic of the Augustan poets sits on the shore of the Black Sea in a provincial town at the edge of the known world and writes home, stripped of everything except the voice that got him there. It is in the end a story about what poetry costs, which is an appropriate way to end the education of a gentleman. End of lecture 14.